As momentum grows towards Starship Flight 12, SpaceX is keeping busy with work across 4 different Starship launch pads at different stages of construction across Texas and Florida. Work is also in full swing on future ships, and we're seeing prep for pre-launch testing of the booster and ship for the next Starship flight. If that isn't enough, we've got even more Raptor testing and a whole slew of test tanks awaiting qualification. From Starbase, Texas to the Space Coast of Florida, this is your Starship Update, sponsored by Storyblocks. Let's kick off the episode at Starbase's launch site, where a great deal of work is underway preparing for 2 new launch pads. Sort of. The most advanced in construction is, of course, Pad 2, which has recently received part of its ship quick disconnect arm. The part that was installed is the section of the arm at the end of the assembly, which contains the connection port to the ship. It is rather like the forearm, so to speak. Ever since its installation, teams have begun connecting it to the rest of the arm, assembling all the lines that link the shoulder with the forearm. As we highlighted in last week's episode, this new design of the ship quick disconnect arm includes walkways that provide better access to the hardware for the crews who need to go up there and work on it. Since it is clearly not a great idea to have to jump from one walkway to another, they've installed new sections of walkway to bridge the gap between the shoulder and the forearm section as part of this connection between the 2 parts of the arm. At the same time, more hardware on the arm is being connected to the tower, with most of the smaller pipes and flexible hoses now connected to the tower systems. The quick disconnect port itself has also been covered with a special protective cover while all of this work continues on the arm. You really do not want that port to be full of dust and other particulates before using it on an actual ship. With this connection work being finalised, SpaceX has started to put this arm to work by testing its swing motion in and out of the tower. The movements we have seen are most likely not at full speed, but you have to start somewhere. We have also seen the booster quick disconnect ports on the launch mount at Pad 2 being deployed for the first time in a few weeks. In case you don't remember, at the end of last week, SpaceX completed installing all the swing arm doors for the hold-down arms of the launch mount. So, with that installed, a ship quick disconnect arm now being able to move on its own, and the booster quick disconnects on the launch mount also being deployed, it would be interesting to see whether, in the next few weeks, we see a full retraction test of all arms and umbilicals to test a liftoff sequence. Remember that at liftoff, both booster umbilicals retract, the ship arm also swings away, and the 20 hold-down arms close and retract into the launch mount, and all of them have to retract at the same time. We saw a lot of retraction tests of the booster quick disconnect ports on the mount a while ago, so when this full system test happens, we will probably see a few attempts in order to get everything correctly timed and coordinated. We've also seen some work this past week on the chopstick arms on Tower 2, as well as even more tank farm testing. I can tell you any day now we are probably going to see a full system test with the chopsticks, tower vent and everything else. I would keep an eye on Starbase Live for that if I were you, because that will give us a glimpse into all the testing that we will have on the pad ahead of Flight 12. As for when that will happen, we'll have to talk about it later in the episode. Now, I said at the beginning of the episode that they are working on 2 new launch pads at Starbase, and the reason I said 2 is because the second one, ironically, is Pad 1. Yes, they have already launched there and construction started all the way back in 2020, but its launch mount was demolished and a lot of the systems are now gone. This week, even more old hardware was removed, such as the last of the smaller deluge tanks that were located on the back of Tower 1. They have also been removing a lot of the piping from the base of the tower and from the surrounding ground. On the tank farm side of things, they have also removed the methane reclamation tank that was used to store recondensed methane from the vehicle boil-off, and on top of that, they have also removed our beloved pope vent. The pope vent was the most prominent of all the vents at the tank farm, and it was used to vent gaseous nitrogen during tank farm chill down and conditioning. It was named that because it resembled the chimney on the Sistine Chapel that is used to announce a new pope with white smoke. Just in this case, the vent announced a new test or launch attempt. Every time it started during pre-testing or pre-launch operations, it meant that the tank farm chill down was well underway and that we were just a few hours away from a test or a launch at Pad 1. But with Pad 1 changing designs, that also means moving to a new chill down and conditioning process. With most of this old hardware now gone, Pad 1 is slowly transitioning from a demolition site back to a construction site. In other words, SpaceX's job now is to build a new pad there rather than demolish an old one, hence me saying earlier that they are now building a second new pad at Starbase. Part of this construction work will involve expanding the launch site footprint towards the south, which should allow crews to begin excavation of the new flame trench, as well as construction of the new deluge tank farm and the addition of more tank farm systems on the back of Tower 1. In recent days, we have seen hardware arriving that may be related to construction for that southern expansion, so stay tuned to upcoming episodes as that work may begin very soon. Besides that southern expansion, SpaceX is working on some other areas of the launch site, but first, a word from our sponsor. Although I'm sure a subset of the NSF community would love to look at my face for 20 minutes straight, that's not the best way to create engaging videos. We like to cut away to a different shot to provide visuals which represent the story we're trying to tell. Recently, we've been talking about the NASA administrator fiasco, and since we don't yet have Capitol Hill Live 24/7, stock footage is our only option. And that's where this video sponsor, Storyblocks, comes in handy. Storyblocks is a stock media library which offers unlimited downloads of a huge range of high-quality stock video, imagery, music, sound effects, and more, all for one predictable subscription cost. Just search for what's needed and, well, there it is. Traditionally, stock platforms would make you pay a fee per asset, but not with Storyblocks. They offer truly unlimited access to authentic content created by real people, which nowadays is becoming even more difficult to find. Anything you download with Storyblocks is 100% royalty-free, pre-licensed, and ready to use. Storyblocks keeps the library fresh as well. If, like us, you create multiple videos per week, you don't want things to start feeling repetitive. On top of that, the library is refreshed with commissioned content based on what Storyblocks members have been searching for on the platform. To get unlimited stock media downloads at one set price, click the link in the description. Besides that southern expansion, it seems that SpaceX is starting to put up a new protection wall on the western side of the launch site next to Pad 2. This is similar to the wall that went up back in late 2023 that hosted the Gateway to Mars sign. That sign was only there for a single launch though, and as soon as that took place, it was taken down and removed. Pad 2 is now, in fact, right where that sign once was, and this new wall is technically a little bit further west. But who knows, with Pad 2 nearly complete, perhaps we will see a return of that sign. It really feels very SpaceX to go ahead and do that work before the first launch out of Pad 2 at Starbase. Since Pad 1 is moving from demolition to construction, its side of the tank farm has now been cleared, which means new hardware can be installed that will be useful in the future. For the last couple of weeks, there has been a new continuous flight augering drill at the tank farm, drilling the piles needed for the foundation where a new set of storage tanks will be placed in the future. Aside from that work, teams have also continued carrying out groundworks in front of the tank farm, which could be related to connecting it all with the future air separation unit right across the road from the launch site. With most of the smaller pieces of hardware now in place, it is time for the big infrastructure to arrive and be installed on site, such as the distillation tower that will be used to separate nitrogen and oxygen from the rest of the gases in the air. For that reason, SpaceX has been working on reconfiguring the large LR-11000 crane they had at the launch site, and they have also moved it from the launch site over to the air separation unit worksite. It would not be surprising if, in the next week or so, we start seeing the major pieces of infrastructure arriving and being installed with the help of this crane, so that is another thing to look forward to in future episodes. Since we're on launch site construction, let's now head over to the Florida Space Coast and have a look at what's been happening in the past week at the two Starship launch pads under construction. The one which is furthest along in construction is of course Launch Complex 39A. In last week's episode, we mentioned that crews had rolled out the shoulder section of the ship quick disconnect arm for the Starship tower at this pad. Well, just a few days later, teams lifted and installed it on the tower, and since then they have started connecting the arm to the systems on the tower. Unfortunately, this launch site in Florida has considerably less public access than Starbase, which means there's little chance of close-up photos or videos of most of this work. However, we do still see other activity, such as the deliveries of the hold-down arms for the LC-39A launch mount. Over the past week, quite a number of them have passed in front of our Space Coast Live 24/7 cameras and have been seen lifted and lowered for installation on the launch mount. SpaceX has also delivered the protective hoods for the booster quick disconnects and the doors that will protect the two umbilicals when they retract after T0. In the coming weeks, much of this work may be overshadowed by what's happening at neighbouring Launch Complex 39B as NASA's SLS rocket for Artemis II rolled out this week to the pad ahead of launch. This rollout was captured from space via an Airbus Earth observation satellite, which also happened to capture LC-39A in the process. Thanks to this, we can see further progress at the Starship launch site from above, which is very welcome. This satellite image is of a higher resolution than usual, allowing us to see more details than in previous satellite pictures. For example, individual pump assemblies and subcoolers installed at the Starship tank farm to the north of the pad are clearly visible. There are still some storage tanks missing, mostly indicated by several empty spots next to those which are already in place. We can also see propellant lines laid over the ground from the tank farm to the area immediately behind the tower. Judging by this overhead view, it also seems SpaceX may indeed use the spherical tank located to the northeast at LC-39A. This tank was originally a liquid hydrogen tank installed at 39A during the Apollo era and was later used during the shuttle program. Since Falcon does not use hydrogen, the sphere remained unused for at least a decade until a few years ago. That was when SpaceX took it over, refurbished it, and converted it into a liquid methane sphere. They even installed subcoolers, additional liquid methane tanks, and liquid nitrogen tanks for chill down, but that older setup was later removed in favour of the new one. When that happened, it seemed that the tank would no longer be used, but with propellant lines now laid over towards this tank, perhaps that assumption was premature and they are indeed going to use it after all. It would be pretty cool to see Apollo-era hardware in use for Starship launches. In last week's episode, we looked at an earlier satellite shot of LC-39A and noted that the pipes leading up to the back of the launch tower and launch mount were covered, so we thought everything is connected already. Just like with the methane sphere, that may have been a little bit premature, because in this new satellite image, the pipes are uncovered once again. Several green deluge pipes are visible lying next to these commodity trenches, and we have continued to see some of those delivered to the pad on our Space Coast Live cameras. Looking down into the launch mount, we can also see that more flame trench wall sections have been installed, and one of them on the northeast side appears to be flush against the launch mount in a similar arrangement to what we can see at Pad 2. With all the work going on at LC-39A, some things feel like deja vu, since they're mostly a repeated version of what we've seen at Starbase's Pad 2, but with a few months delay. A similar situation is happening at Space Launch Complex 37, where SpaceX is starting work on yet another Starship launch pad. Much like at Starbase's Pad 1, the work over the past several months has been focused on removing the old hardware present at the site and preparing the ground for construction of the first two pads planned for Slick 37. It's not easy to keep track of construction there, as it's deep inside a military base, the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, but every now and then we can follow this work through our satellite images our friend Harry Stranger acquires via regular Space Coast flyovers, or, as in this week's case, through launch pictures of Falcon 9 launches from neighbouring Space Launch Complex 40. Yes, sometimes getting updates really comes down to that. In the launch picture, we can see the work going on at Space Launch Complex 37 in the background. The yellow crane visible is the huge LR-13000 crane, which was previously used at 39A to lift the Starship launch mount. This crane is still being assembled, but once complete, it should assist with stacking the new Starship tower at Slick 37. To the left, there is a continuous flight augering drill, similar to the one we just discussed at Pad 1's tank farm. This drill bores holes into the ground, and as the auger is removed, the hole is filled with concrete. Once filled, a rebar cage is lowered into the concrete. In fact, the picture shows a crane nearby with a rebar cage already lifted and prepared for lowering. Once the concrete cures, this forms one of the hundreds of foundation piles needed to support the brand new tower and flame trench area. We know this because it's the same method used at Starbase's Pad 2, and so far the other new pads are following this pattern. In the future, we'll continue to see this with the redesign work happening at Pad 1 and the second pad that will eventually be built at Slick 37. Of course, there's always the possibility that more Starship launch pads will be created further down the line, but these ones are the ones we know of being built right now. With Elon wanting hourly Starship launches within 3 years, they'll certainly need more of these, and quickly. While the Space Coast Starship launch pads may be behind in construction compared to Starbase's Pad 2, the Florida Gigabay is much further advanced than the one at Starbase. One of our team members in Florida, Julia Bergeron, has been keeping track of its construction progress with weekly shots from across the Indian River. This week we had a special update as she and one of our Starbase team members, Colleen, teamed up to take photos from similar angles of both gigabays. We can see that level 4 of the Florida Gigabay is progressing quite well on the western side of the building, which should eventually be right next to the Florida Starfactory whenever that gets built. The eastern side, which is further away in Julia's view, started later, so it is only just beginning to get to its third level. It is in fact at that third level where SpaceX is currently with the Starbase gigabay. In that case, the sections for the third level started around the middle of the building. Just a few days ago, they began installing pieces at the back of the building, the side facing the megabays. So far, it seems the front of the building, the side leading to Highway 4, will be the last to receive sections for this third level. Alright, after all that talk of construction, let's move on to the Starship vehicles and their testing. It's been yet another week without any news regarding Booster 19's status or whether it will be rolled out to masses for cryogenic testing. However, there was a road closure scheduled for Sunday night for a transport from masses to the production site. This allowed the Booster Thrust Simulator stand to head to Megabay 1 and collect Booster 19. Once Booster 19 is at masses, we'll be back to roughly where we were 2 months ago with Booster 18, which is when it suffered its rupture during pressure testing at the test site. Hopefully, none of that occurs this time, considering SpaceX has likely carried out additional preventative work. For example, over the last few weeks, we have seen SpaceX moving composite overwrapped pressure vessels, commonly known as COPVs, from the Starbase production site out to masses for testing and then back to the production site. We have also seen some of them leave Starbase altogether, and they may be undergoing tests at SpaceX's McGregor test site a few hours to the north. Another vehicle yet to leave one of the bays is Ship 39, which is still residing inside Megabay 2. Fortunately, all the scaffolding SpaceX had set up around it was swiftly removed by the time of our previous episode, and we can now report that Ship 39 is, for the most part, scaffold-free. With the scaffolding gone, it's much easier to see the work SpaceX carried out on the heat shield tiles while it was in place. This work looks very similar to the drilling we've observed on Ship 40's nose cone over the last few weeks, and may, in fact, be the exact same procedure but applied to Ship 39. In Ship 39's case, the drilling took place over a much larger visible area of the heat shield, extending from near the bottom of the payload bay section up to the last row of pin tiles on the nose cone. The very tip of the nose cone has heat shield tiles which are glued on rather than pinned. We're not entirely sure why this was done to the tiles, but it's interesting that all of this work was carried out on the starboard side of the vehicle, that is the left-hand side of the ship when facing the heat shield. Given this, it very much appears to be some sort of experiment SpaceX is running on these tiles ahead of Flight 12. On previous flights, when SpaceX has tested heat shield tiles, we've also noticed some kind of difference between one side of the ship and the other, likely so they can compare one clean side with the side that has the experiments. With this entire tile experiment work now applied to Ship 39, surely it must be ready to head out for cryogenic proof testing, right? Well, last week we mentioned how the S39.1 test tank had borrowed Ship 39's thrust simulator stand and moved out to the Massey outpost for testing. Testing that has already started, by the way. More on that shortly. So, given this situation, we concluded that cryo-testing may have to wait a little longer. But then SpaceX moved the ship's static fire stand, affectionately nicknamed the Crab Stand, from the Massey outpost all the way back to the Sanchez lot. This was the first time since Ship 36's explosion in June that this stand had been moved outside Massey's. The stand still has scaffolding inside it, but its dance floor, which is used both to cover and provide access to the ship engine section, is now located at Sanchez. So perhaps it was rolled back to receive that and thereby further complete its refurbishment following Ship 36's explosion? But what if SpaceX also intends to conduct proof testing of Ship 39 on the static fire stand once this work is complete? Well, that's one of the many theories currently circulating within the Starship community. Emphasis on the word theory. Performing cryo-testing on that stand wouldn't be as comprehensive a test as doing so on the thrust simulator stand, since it lacks the thrust rams that push on the aft dome of the ship to simulate the Raptor's thrust. But it could serve as a quick test of the vehicle systems before the full cryogenic test once the thrust sim stand becomes available. It could also help SpaceX proof test all the new hardware installed at Massey's static fire test area, since all of that is new equipment, and it might also give us a clue as to what the new truss structure at Massey's is for. Since we've talked quite a bit about the work on Ship 39's heat shield, it would be wrong of me to not mention what's been going on with Ship 40, the other ship receiving the drilling treatment. In the latest views of this ship's nose cone from our Starbase team, we can see that SpaceX has erased the numbers that were once written on the tiles next to the drilled holes, now presenting clean tiles with just the holes remaining. This was one of the main differences we had noticed between Ship 39 and Ship 40, since S39 didn't have anything written on the tiles, while S40 did, as of last week. But now, all of that is gone. it certainly adds more mystery to the whole experiment. Given that it's not just Ship 39 that has this experiment, but also Ship 40, it may be something SpaceX intends to run on both Flight 12 and Flight 13, and hopefully they'll announce what it's for when the time comes. As mentioned earlier in the episode, testing of production vehicles can sometimes be delayed by the testing of test tanks, such as Ship 39.1. That test tank resumed testing this week after being rolled back to Massey's on the Ship Thrust Simulator stand. Alongside S39.1 are B18.1 and B18.3, two booster test tanks used to qualify the aft and forward ends of the new version 3 Super Heavy booster. Both of these tanks were also tested this past week, including structural load testing of the B18.3 test tank and its simulated ship skirt on top. After much anticipation, SpaceX is finally proving the structural integrity of the new booster forward truss that will be used on version 3 to vent out the Raptor exhaust during hot staging. But if you thought that was the end of the booster test tanks, don't celebrate just yet, because there is another one. This one, however, is not at Starbase, but rather at SpaceX's McGregor test site a few hours north. Unlike some of the previous test tanks, this one we had actually seen before and were expecting to appear at McGregor at some point. It arrived at the site a few months ago, while a previous booster test tank was already at the same test area in McGregor, so we assumed it was put in storage and that it would be tested whenever everything was ready for it. And well, that time must be now, since it's been installed on that stand. This test tank seems to be yet another one for the central transfer tube of the new version 3 boosters, mostly based on the fact that SpaceX was able to transport it by road all the way to McGregor without shutting down half of the roads in the state of Texas. It's probably what would have happened if this had been a wider 9-meter diameter load like one of the test tanks at Massey's. If so, this would make it the third such version 3 transfer tube test tank to be tested at McGregor. That's a lot of T's in one sentence. McGregor is also well known for testing Raptor engines, and sometimes these tests don't tend to go very well. This week we saw one of the tests on the Raptor vertical stand end in flames and dark smoke, almost as if Raptor had suddenly switched fuels to kerosene like Merlin. Following this incident, SpaceX has paused testing from this stand and is now working on it to bring it back online as soon as possible. We've also seen cranes lifting parts from the stand's flame trench, which might mean there was potential damage to the flame deflector during the test anomaly. Despite this issue, this week has been quite active in terms of Raptor testing at McGregor, with 24 Raptor tests as of recording, and possibly many more by the time you're watching. Of these 24 tests, the majority took place at the Raptor South stand and included tests during the weekend, a rarity at McGregor when it comes to Raptor testing. Most of the tests at Raptor South were shorter in duration, no longer than a minute and a half, but there were two tests in particular which lasted 375 seconds, just over 6 minutes. These burn durations are very similar to the duration of a ship's ascent burn, so perhaps these may be engines destined for a future ship. Very quickly, you may have noticed that Jack hasn't been on these episodes for a while, and a few of you have asked us why in the comments. In case you missed it, Jack is no longer at NSF. His atrocities towards bacon simply left us no other choice. No, I'm just kidding. He's moved to a new job as the communications specialist at Astroforge, an asteroid mining company. That's why myself and Max have been on your screens, and due to a certain ESA Aerospace launching from Norway this week, that's why it's me today. You might have also noticed the name of this show has slightly changed from Starbase to Starship Update, and that's due to the fact that Starbase is no longer the sole Starship site we cover. Thanks again to Storyblocks for sponsoring this video. Remember, you can download unlimited stock media at one set price with Storyblocks by going to storyblocks.com/NSF or clicking the link in the description. I've been Ryan Caden for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.